Is it on? Great, thanks, John. Hi, forgive me for being slightly disorganized. I've been running from one thing to the next and then had to run and unpack my stuff for checkout.
Pack it up, right?
Yes, exactly. And I have emailed some of the notes for this panel and now I can't access them. So, I'll just swing it. I'm Elizabeth Ham, I'll be the moderator for this, which is a panel on sort of tropes of nostalgia in recent speculative fiction. I will start by letting our August panelists introduce themselves, starting with...
Oh, okay. I'm Andrea Hairston, and I write plays and novels. Reverting Wildfire is a fantasy novel, or a magic realist novel that takes place in the past. And I'm very interested in people who take interest in the past, is nostalgia, you know, for past forms, for past tropes, for stories that have been told and stories that haven't been told. So that's why I wanted to be on this panel, because I like history.
Andrea should also, I will say that she is one of next year's guests of honor.
I'm John Benson. I'm editor and publisher of Rock on the Bus, which is a long-running, very small press magazine that publishes fantasy, horror, and speculative fiction of all forms. And this was a best-of collection that was done from our magazine in 2005.
I'm Scott Lynch. I'm the author of The Lies of Loch Lomond and its sequels. I'm 35. My favorite color is blue. I don't know why I was drinking last night, but my liver has done overtime this morning. Beer and coaches.
I'm Elizabeth Bear. I write science fiction and fantasy, and I also teach writing at various workshops. And I am not nostalgic.
I'm Rob Killheffer. I've been a reviewer and critic and editor in the field in various capacities for about 25 years now, so it's getting kind of scary. You know, I've kind of got a yes and no kind of attitude to the whole question. There's interesting things about nostalgia and works that are self-consciously in conversation with works of the past, but I think there's always a need to keep driving forward and regenerating the genre and keeping it really alive. So I think we can probably see good and good and bad.
And again, I'm Elizabeth Ham, I'm a writer and critic, and I'll be kind of asking the questions here. So to start with, one of the two books that was mentioned,
I think it's among others.
Redshirts. And Redshirts.
Thank you. And these are novels that draw on the tropes and actually the history of our genre themselves as their subject matter in some part. Among others, there's a young woman protagonist coming of age in the 1970s who sort of her entire moral and sensual and romantic education comes through reading science fiction and fantasy books. Some other recent books that have dealt with these tropes are Ned Vizzini's The Other Normals, which takes on Dungeons and Dragons. It's a YA novel. It's very funny, but also very sweet, and it's sort of a nostalgic look at the D&D world. Lev Grossman's The Magician and the Magician King, which certainly take the reading experience of the Harry Potter novels and Narnia and sort of reinvents them. Charles Hughes, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe. Jar Jar Binks Must Die, which is a wonderful book that is not a novel, but it's a very, very funny memoir by David Kimmel. Dan Kimmel. I'm sorry? Dan Kimmel. Dan Kimmel.
I don't know if the Charles Hughes is really all that nostalgic.
What?
Yeah, I think we can argue about what the word nostalgia means, because I think a lot of the things that you're mentioning are often satiric. So they're engaging with the past, presuming that we have an understanding of the past in order to play with it, not necessarily to say, oh wow, I really want it to act.
Well, that's a great place to start off, because the definition of nostalgia, comes from the Greek, and it's the Homeric terms, and it's homecoming and ache. So it's like a longing for a return to something. So
There's this thing that I think that's kind of an error of thought in one of the ways we define science fiction, because we have a tendency as a genre, as writers and readers both, to privilege the novum, right? To have this idea that science fiction is all about the new idea. And really, the vast majority of science fiction has not been about a brand new idea since sometime in the 1930s. This idea that books that engage with the past or engage with the history of the genre is a new thing, is some sort of present-day nostalgia, failure to move forward. Where does that leave Harry Harrison's Build the Galactic Hero? This is a thing. The genre argument is a thing that's been going on as long as there's been a genre. And the other issue I have is that the idea that if you have to have a new idea, you have to really cherry pick to as a critic, I think, to come away with this idea that science fiction is stuck in the past and ignore books like Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death, which I don't think there's really been anything like that before. I mean, there are certain aspects of it that you can see in other places, but that particular book seemed like a very new thing to me. And for every quote nostalgic book, most of them to me seem to be in some ways criticisms.
Yes, I think they're satiric, so they're engaging with the past, but I'm not feeling that they're longing for it in the Sehnsucht definition from the Greek or from the German. So there's no like, I want to return to a time when things were great and life was wonderful, and that's when we were writing like Redshirt science fiction. I don't think that's what Redshirts is doing at all. So,
problematizing is not nostalgia.
Yeah,
Like I said, that's been one of the most interesting features of a genre, especially our genre, since the very beginning, has been the conversation, the very intentional, reassessment of another writer's scenario. You've got all the things you mentioned, Build the Galactic Hero, you've got The Forever War and Starship Troopers, you've got things like Arena, and then you've got Enemy Mine, which takes the same scenario and decides to end happily, peacefully. And this is a different
Ender's Game and Old Man's War,
and so this is, that as far as that goes, right? You can't possibly see that as a new development or a pathological development. Those both.
I think it's just like how art works.
Yeah.
We're in conversation, with other artists.
Yeah, and that's exists in any literature. That's what it is. I mean, and recombining elements. That's sort of, I think, except for in this case, like I said, with the obsession with the novum, which is kind of.
I mean, novums are really cool.
Yeah.
But how often do you actually find one?
Well, you don't. And so I think we often forget that our literature works just like every other literature. It's mostly a recombination of ideas in new ways and stuff that are just exciting as a novum. Like you're saying, in Here's Death. It's not that nothing in there has ever happened, but it's the combination and the treatment is all new.
The Quantum Thief, there are not actually a lot of new ideas in there, but the way he's mixing them up is
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the surprise comes not necessarily from the novel, but from the juxtaposition and the recombination. And then it makes me think in a different way, which is as much fun as having a new idea.
Much of literature comes from engaging with the past. And I'm thinking in this case, sometimes we need new pasts. And I'm thinking of Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. This is a past that we didn't have very long ago. I mean, where you have an entire book where a quest has to be figured for $260 billion. So it's a real quest, not some sword. that where you've got millions and millions of people trying to figure out every video game since the very first ones going back before there were arcade games. And so the book, it looks nostalgic in a way because there are hundreds of games that are mentioned in that book. But it's a way of developing a sort of a story within a story for a different kind of quest set in a future, which makes it a science fiction story where you're seeing a juxtaposition of two different worlds in it. But that past didn't exist until very recently.
And I guess I fail to see how a book like Peter Watt's Blind Sight or Ted Chiang's The Life Cycle of Software Objects is nostalgic.
No.
That's my basic problem with the premise of this panel.
Well, I think there's no
I
question.
came here to pick a fight. None of you want to fight with me.
There's so many examples of absolutely new stuff, and I think even the people who proposed the panel and sort of recognize that this is, no one would say that this is 100% or even 90% taken out of the field. It's not that you can't find ways up. It's wondering if there is a more than normal current theme of this that's happening. And so we can establish pretty quickly that there's plenty of clearly not nostalgic, new, exciting, intellectually thrilling work being done that we can just have. And so there's no question, all of us are on the same page with that.
We won't pause on that or wait. There are other questions we can find later.
So we can kind of dispense with that one. I think we've all done that. We've all come here with a statement. But I think what you mentioned now, the Walton and the Grossman books and some of those things, which are, there's something different happening there. I'm not necessarily going to say that it's again, pathological or worrisome, but what's happening in those, it seems to me, is that they are not engaging in a conversation with previous works so much as working with recreating the reader experience of an earlier time period and looking to that and investigating that in a way which is a sort of a new thing in the field. Like there hasn't been, I can't think of anybody who just sort of as explicitly as Joe Walton did tell a story of somebody who's reading 70s science fiction and growing up on that. And that's something that is kind of or Grossman and kind of processing your Narnia fandom and that sort of thing, and what that did to you as a young person.
Yeah, and I think that's what John was saying about the video game history. So we have now new history that then we can write about, and it happens not to be in the 19th century. It's the 20th century that's now our history, and then we can reflect on that.
And that may be just more of an interesting development given the age now of our field, that we're old enough now.
Yeah.
There is this history that now we can actually read about directly. That in the 70s, everybody was still alive, sort of, who had been around then, and it hadn't yet become entirely history for that.
Right.
I think I cut Scott off earlier. I'm sorry.
You did. Well, so far we've talked entirely about creative engagement with this concept that we're discussing. We've talked entirely about this from the writer's perspective, and we're sort of at odds here with the description of the panel itself. Whoever wrote it, I mean, I didn't write it. I don't know who did. But we haven't discussed the alleged existence of a perceived critical or a perceived reader impetus to decry the output of the present in the genre as opposed to the great and glorious past. I mean, the description of the panel references a rather legendary cranky old man column written by Paul Kincaid, which raised a lot of interesting points, but behind which I could not actually get, because it struck me as very much of the, all the virtue has gone out of the universe, and autumn winds me its great coils, sort of.
And why don't 14-year-olds want to read high?
Yes, and it plays into that whole rather tedious, and I understand that, as inevitably as we age, we begin to develop, dissatisfaction with the universe around us.
No, I'm older than you. I like the world better and better every day.
I'm a pretty happy guy. Since about noon, I've been pretty happy. I wasn't pretty happy when I woke up this morning. But there's, there is that perceived current of, science fiction no longer. It's no longer
golden age is over.
The big science done big. Test test tubes and atom smashers, and Robert Hyland bestriding the world like a colossus while Isaac Asimov holds it on his shoulders.
Don't visualize. Don't visualize.
Hyland Asimov and a white tiger would be a pretty cool magazine. So we talked entirely about the artistic engagement with the past, and then the playful and multi-leveled artistic engagement, and the loving and the stinging artistic engagement. But we really haven't discussed Paul Kincaid's I guess the general theory thrown out by him or people like him that essentially everything sucks now and we've gone to pot.
This is from my Aldous Wooders quote.
You wanted an argument, and
You wanted somebody to watch it?
Can I deploy my Aldous Wooders quote?
You've been waiting for months to deploy it.
I have. The time has come. This is from 1967. Okay, and he's talking about the new wave. It doesn't really matter, however, the eyes through which Delaney sees, or the tongue with which Zelazny speaks, the ear with which Aldous listens, the snake-dry touch of Ballard's fingertips, are the organs of comprehensible senses which happen to be connected to incomprehensible but very lucid brains. It would not only be dreadful if they suddenly began writing for the 1944 Astounding, it would be impossible. The point is, if you are still reading everything from the viewpoint of the 1944 Astounding, in a few years you will find that these people, whether you approve of them or not, have picked up the field, carried it elsewhere, and left you with nothing but a complete collection of yellowed, crumble-edged bewilderment. And I think that there's a certain part of our genre, a large and increasingly central part of our genre, this, the rainbow age of science fiction, as I keep calling it, that is currently engaged in picking up the entire field and moving it 6 steps in the other direction. And there are a lot of people who really aren't comfortable with that. And I feel a little bad for them because we're kind of stealing their toys, but I don't feel bad enough for them to stop.
I went through this process of thinking that science fiction had ended when I was like 18 years old. And when, at the time when, a few years ago, I remember everybody talking about here, actually, about how 1967 was this wonderful year when science fiction started to branch out and do other things. And I'm like, at the time, I was like crying. I didn't need any of this fancy crap among my science fiction. So anyway, it took me a long time to recover because I was too regimented in my view of what science fiction was. I think a typical sort of male 50s kind of view. And so I wandered off and did, mysteries and horror and stuff like that. And then discovered years later that, first of all, hard science fiction hadn't ever actually disappeared. And secondly, my view of how science fiction works, speculative fiction, nobody even bothers to use science fiction anymore as a word, is actually the better for having written on new topics and so on. And I even managed to get over my habit of calling any genre fiction that I didn't like fantasy. So several years ago, when Sandra Tate pointed out to me that for 15 years I'd been publishing fantasy in my own magazine, and so I had to change my definitions a little bit.
Well, I've lived long enough to see, things go in cycles, and every few years it's the death of a novel, there's the death of science fiction.
The theater has been dead so long. It was dead before I even was born, So I'm doing a ghost art form.
Have you seen the T-shirts that there's a Midwestern writers group who call themselves the Rat Bastards? They were selling in Wisconsin a few years back that say science fiction is dead in very small letters, and there's a rocket ship, like a Hugo-style rocket ship tumbling.
But there is no doubt that we are in a paradigm shift within the way, not the way that stories are told, but the media that we're using. And I do not feel that digital media is the death of books or storytelling or anything like that at all. But it is changing, and we, I think perhaps by definition where we stand now, we really probably cannot see where this is going to take us. 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years down the road. Do you all feel that there are writers now, like yourselves or others, who are actually perhaps depicting in the strangeness or just you know, the originality or whatever of their vision that are giving us a real glimpse into where we might be based on where we are now? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Are we looking for like specific examples? Or?
Yeah, any specific example? I'm just curious, just throwing this out
Elliot
there.
Godard, I think.
I didn't remember.
Elliot Godard, who is a French science fiction writer. She was nominated for the Campbell a few years back, and her story, Clark's World story, Immersion, just won a Locus Award. Yeah.
She's doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. And she's in her early 30s, you know, I think. So you know, the up and coming young writers really are, and she's writing reasonably hard science fiction that has a strong cultural element and sociological element. So I also think that if you put too much sociology in your science fiction, some people won't recognize it, even if the science is good.
Yeah, I'm going to, rather than talk about examples of that, I want to talk about the flip side, which is one of the things that Kincaid brings up that I think is worth at least considering. I don't necessarily think you're right, but one of the things that he talks about that isn't just kind of cranky old man thing is that he seems to detect in the year's best collections that he was reviewing at that time a kind of a loss of conviction in the futures that were being portrayed, a sense that the writers, when they weren't depicting, that they didn't feel able to depict that future because of the rapid change and so forth. And so we're reverting to familiar tropes, but they kind of knew it, and you could feel it in the writing that they didn't believe this was really the future anyway. It was just one of the futures that we knew, and we didn't know how to write it in one yet, and is that a problem? And it relates, I think, to an essay published 10 years ago by Judith Berman, on her blog first, I think, and then in the Nursive, that she called Science Fiction Without the Future, in which she read the entirety of a whole year's worth of Asimov's, and found that the vast majority of stories seemed to be presenting a fear of the future. They were many of them were about older people unable to handle the future, retreating from it. And so, to what extent might that be going on if you aren't a writer who feels like you've got a grasp of where things might be? Are we now seeing some of that happen that is being perceived as nostalgia, as a kind of retreat?
I would point out that if we're talking about, you know, a year's worth of Asimov's and a bunch of year's best anthologies, we're talking about basically one editor.
We did the Rich work.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
I agree with you. Yes, you're talking about.
But I'm talking about the stories that one editor is picking, and I don't think that's a fair overview of the field.
But just to take the idea of if you have characters who are afraid of the future, you know, are you afraid of the future? I think that's a, you know, really strange, you know, leap to make. I mean, also, if you're writing about the future, are you writing about the future, or are you writing about right now? So the question is, are we afraid of the future? Are we afraid of our technology? Are we having a difficult time with things like, you know, the Frankenstein monsters that we have let loose? And, you know, were people less afraid of that, you know, 50 years ago? And the answer to that question might be yes, because we're now living some of the consequences of the things that got let loose 50 years ago. So again, the future has a longer history now, you know, the technological future, which was newer in the 50s and it's much older now. So we're living with the consequences of our amazing discoveries.
And also of the shifts that have happened.
Yes.
So
yeah.
the science fiction that you know, the cranky old man,
I'm cranky.
But who are always, like, as you say, kind of feel like everything's collapsed and died, the astounding 1944.
Yes.
I mean, that was all one particular historical period that had a different relationship with technology in the future. And isn't necessarily a problem that we have a different relationship.
Are any of us actually more scared of the future than John Marr was?
I don't know.
Nobody's more scared of the future than John Marr.
Our war is in the 20s and the robots take over the world and kill all the people. I mean, so we've been obviously thinking about that for a long time. That's the first time that we have robots, right? And they, you know, they replace all human workers. But I'm just worried about that.
One of the anthologies that Paul mentions in his essay is Edge of Infinity, which I happen to have a story in.
Yeah.
He makes the comment that this is only solar system, only solar system, and there are no aliens in it. My story is actually from the point of view of an alien on a gas giant, an unspecified gas giant, probably Jupiter. And the entire point of the anthology when we were putting it together was to give some plausible hard science versions of what a positively technological settled solar system might be like. It was the intent of the anthology was the exact opposite of what he characterizes it as.
That might have been a problem with the title, because I found myself a little surprised when I encountered the title being Infinity.
Edge of Infinity.
It sounds like the
idea
project
is
is to get way out there.
Well,
The
yeah,
answer
this
is
is
no,
the
it's
edge.
the opposite.
This is the stage before you go out.
Right. But
So-
so I think there was a problem with many readers, including him, of understanding
What they
what
were
the,
reading.
what the project was, and being a little shocked when they started reading the stories that it was more near to the edge than they felt it than they believed. So there's a lot of confusion. And also like that, there's no reason that an anthology project that is specifically investigating that scenario is a problem. How should it be? Just, not every anthology has to decide to explore, vastly far future.
Ian Banksian, yeah.
Right. We had until recently, Ian Banks doing that, and others. And so what happened, I think, there is that Strahan sensed that there was something missing. There was a hole to fill to say, let's try to do what you're saying. Positively technological solar system, spreading humanity. And so he said, that's why I want to do an anthology. Not because it's already being done a lot, but listen, my experience as an editor was always that. Whatever I wanted to do was whatever I didn't think was being done enough. So he did that not as an affirmation of
We're never getting out of the solar system
right,
alive.
but as saying, maybe we should think more about this, there's cool stories we can tell about this. So it's things like that.
Speaking as somebody who's generally a negative Nelly on the predictive function of science fiction in general, I feel that the predictive function of science fiction is incredibly overstated, and that generally speaking, science fiction has never predicted a damn thing except by accident.
Yeah, so I think a prophet isn't someone who talks about the future. A prophet is someone who understands right now and can speak about it, and so we confuse those.
There's an inspirational value.
Yeah, right.
I think it's arguable, it's entirely plausible that there may simply be people who are comfortable writing in a paradigm, like myself, where we are not writing anything that is intended to be specifically prescriptive or predictive. It is not anchored to any particular vision of the future. It is intended to be plausible, but we are very comfortable with the fact that it is merely a nebulous possibility. We do not intend it to be a concrete projection in the classic get out your slide rule and count from the present to the future.
We're playing with possibilities.
I'm not entirely sure that lacks conviction is, that sounds rather damning. I don't have conviction that any of my predictions are going to come true, but that's kind of the point. I have conviction in them as stories. I have conviction in them as bubbles of their own reality, but not as my extrapolation of where we are definitely going. And I
This
think,
is not the plan.
yeah, that certainty and that meta conversation about the predictive function of science fiction really did used to be entitled to a lot of the genre. It was revolutionary when Heinlein laid out his future timeline, and people thought this was a very, very cool toy to play with.
One of the things, well, two things that have changed, I think, that are important. One is that a lot of 50s and 60s science fiction took place when the cutting edge of science was space, where there was a lot of investment, literally investment in terms of dollars in the space race, but a lot of scientific. It was the peak of what science was at the time, and it's much more predictable. It's much more mechanical and predictable than science is once you get off into other areas. There are very few of us that understand science now. Science is much more complex, and therefore, we've moved into areas that are no longer as easy to access, or as commonly held, I think, among as many people. And in addition, I think, to some extent, we have Not that relativity wasn't around or Heisenberg or anything else in the old days, but I think because our philosophy of science and philosophy in general has changed into a sort of postmodern view, we're not so certain about things anymore. We're not so sure what the truth is or what the future is or predictability or anything like that. We're not so sure about the other.
All of that happened. I mean, Gödel and all those people, you know, Heisenberg, they were all earlier. So they were at the time of the 50s, that stuff had already been worked out. And if you were studying science, you knew that stuff. You had to. I mean, if you were doing math, I mean, because I was a math physics major, and when I, you know, before I even got to college, we'd already looked at that stuff. We had already known that stuff. So those writers who were also scientists as well, you know, knew that. So I think it was a social reality that they were working from that was different than our social reality now, not the scientific knowledge that we had as a basis.
Yeah.
Because those things have not changed, and I don't know, explaining relativity was hard then, and it's hard now, even though we have like a college version of it.
But in those days, you could have you could get some drama out of equations. This was the era of, you know, slide rules in space.
Yeah.
And I sort of miss, this is a thing I am nostalgic for, I sort of miss slide rules in space because it's an opportunity for drama as a writer, right? You're trying to do the math to solve whatever your problem is. Now you just plug it into your calculator on your phone and it does it for you. You don't get that, can I figure this out in time thing. So you have to come up with more complicated games to play with your characters. If you want narrative tension.
You make things so difficult sometimes.
Yes, the writer's bane.
Andrew, seriously, no, I do think, and I totally agree with you about the predictive discussion. I don't think Kincaid, that's what he meant. I don't think he was talking about nonfiction in that sense.
That was general. I wasn't
Right.
picking poor Paul.
No, I just mean, that's why I think that he's talking about something that I think Gary Wolfe mentions a couple of times in his evaporating genres. And he doesn't think it's happening. In fact, his point is that the evaporation effect is what's preventing this from happening. But he says, of greater concern than simple commercialism is the increasing self-referentiality of many genre texts, a narrowing of horizons that eventually leads to an accelerating inward spiral resulting in a kind of genre implosion and collapse. And I think
Is that Wolf or Kincaid?
that's Wolfe.
Okay. I agree with that.
Right, and I think Kincaid was saying that he was afraid that he was detecting in the stories in those books, which, as you said, are very limited selection. And he admitted that himself in the essays. You know, I'm dealing with this is what. But in these stories, it feels like this inward spiral that a lot of the writers are kind of moving pieces around the board with, you know, without that level of commitment to whatever they're writing. Like I say, not to believe in its literal future factuality, but a commitment to the scenario and its meaning and its purpose, but more as, we're playing a fun game here, we're familiar with, we'll put a little time travel, we'll throw it in, and do stuff. He felt that it was starting to move in this death spiral that Wolfe refers to, and that we're arguing probably isn't happening.
Well, no, I think there's a problem with science fiction in that, that we have become, and one of the reasons that the audience for science fiction has shrunk as compared to the audience for fantasy, is that we have become a little self-referential. It's really hard to read an Ian McDonald novel unless you have read 60 years of science fiction. You know, I'm a third-generation science fiction fan, and I got through Brazil 4 pages a day. Because I would read it, I would get really tired, I would put the book down, and I would have to go think about it. So, I mean, and when you're playing that, but there's nothing wrong with playing improv jazz for people who like improv jazz, but you're not going to attract a lot of rock and roll fans with that. And I think that there are many writers of my generation. This is another thing about Asimov's 10 years ago. It was largely older writers at that point. Sheila Williams has actively gone out and recruited younger writers and for Asimov's to broaden its writer base. And I think the magazine has changed a lot as a result. But there's a thing that many writers, science fiction writers in my generation, are intentionally doing, which is writing gateway science fiction, entry-level science fiction, stuff that you can come to. John Scalzi is doing this. He wants to write books that you can pick up, never having read a science fiction novel before, read them, understand them, get interested in it, and then maybe go read another one, and then maybe another one, and eventually work your way up to the Ian McDonald's and the Ian Banks I think one of the things that Kincaid identifies as a problem is actually partially my generation of writers' solution to the problem that Woolf identifies of, in the immortal words of Kurt Vonnegut, literature should not crawl up its own asshole.
But exactly, I think you're exactly right. What he's describing is this evaporation.
Yeah.
Is this kind of more free-floating recombination of tropes and things in ways that, to Kincaid, defied and kind of in his mind, muddy in a bad way the scene, whereas that's exactly what, according to Wolf, according to, I think, your generation, is exactly the way to keep it going. Is don't feel stuck with the old formulas. Don't decide if you've got a rocket ship, you can't also kind of, like in some of your stories, love crafting.
Yeah, or if it's, or the stuff that I mentioned, Nadia Corfor's book, where you can have a post-apocalyptic world with solid-state computing and a bunch
Yeah,
of
but people argue
high
that
stuff and
stuff
magic.
is fantasy. Because
Yeah.
I write that stuff too, and so people want to argue with me, whether it's fantasy or magic realism or some other term, because it doesn't fit into the older paradigms of science fiction.
I can give you Teresa Nielsen Hayden's and Deborah Doyle's, I can tell you how to argue this one. Once it's got a rocket ship in it, it's fantasy if it's got a unicorn. Then you can turn it back into science fiction by adding a rocket ship. And once it has a rocket ship in it, nothing will turn it back into fantasy except the Holy Grail. Somebody apparently asked Doyle, what if it's the Holy Grail in the shape of a spaceship? And she said, that's a Hugo. Once you've got a rocket ship in it, it's science fiction.
We're at the point in the panel where if the audience has any questions, we can call on a couple of them.
So two of you just hated on your cell phones, and I want to ask you.
No, I love my cell phone, but as a writer, I hate
They
it.
complicate things so much.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm a techie. I've worked in video surveillance, cloud video, basically the state of the art of this thing. And I see science fiction as being a little bit insular because I see a lot of fascinating new technology being developed, and it's not being adopted into science fiction like it was in the past. And I wonder if that's because authors don't like writing about technology.
No, we love writing about technology. What we don't like is the fact that we can spend 50 pages getting a guy lost in the woods, and all he has to do is look at a Google map.
Did you look at what a huge volume of the film and literature of the 20th century would be rendered impossible by the existence of cell phones.
Well,
Ferris Bueller's Day Off would not impossible.
That's what I'm saying. Like, define.
But there are other problems, like when my cell service doesn't work.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful German novel called Blackout. And it's really about what happens when all of the stuff turns off, and he did all this wonderful research. It's unfortunately only in German, so it hasn't been translated, but it's really taking on all of our current technology and surveillance and really horrible worms that get in and do like incredible terrorism. And it's a great book, but it hasn't, they're not sure that it can translate to an English market.
The other thing to bear in mind is that novels are written 2 to 5 years ahead of publication. So a book, if I'm writing a science fiction book now and putting as much cutting-edge technology into it as I can find, in 3 years when the book comes out, the world's going to be a different place.
Well, the cutting-edge technology is visible years out. The fundamental question I'm going to ask is, as the world continues to get smaller and we continue to use cell phones and continue to see everything, if authors can't write in that world, don't you all end up writing fantasy eventually?
We are writing in that world. I'm sorry, but your question's not valid. You're saying we can't write because we're not saying that. We're saying that it's a common technology makes this.
But I don't understand why you're saying that every other story is fantasy just because we're not in the world that you happen to define the world as.
Okay. Can I say one thing?
Yeah, I'm asking you a question.
Just one thing. I asked this is just an observation, I asked this question in a similar panel yesterday, And I got the exact same response of all of the authors simultaneously yelling at me because they were so threatened by my question.
I'm not threatened. I want to clarify, like, why are you pointing fantasy? So I'm asking you a question.
What?
Like, how do you define fantasy? You're saying that a story that doesn't include the particular technology that you're referencing is fantasy. And I'm asking you, is that your definition of...
It doesn't include real science as it exists in the present day world because the author...
Real?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
This is real.
Yeah, well, okay.
It's like
But you're arguing from a false precept.
so I want to ask why you're so threatened by my
I'm
question.
not that's a different thing.
I'm not an author of fiction, so maybe I'll...
You keep trying to tell me my reality.
Excuse me, I'm going to take the moderators, like, just right now, that this may be a conversation that we can continue afterwards in the bar, just so it doesn't, and the gentleman there, and then...
Okay. I grew up in Britain in the 70s. I identified a lot with, amongst others, but particularly, she's a witch. She talks to fairies, but she reads Hal Clement. And the reason I identify with, the reason I question the entire premise of the panel, is that late 70s in Britain, you could go into any high street shop and get indiscriminately on the shelves J.G. Ballard right next to Larry Niven, right next to Paul Anderson or Herman. You're talking about the access science fiction. It was so much easier for somebody like me to join this subculture. And I think rather than nostalgia, it's looking forward to what we're going to have again when we shift towards e-publishing, where family, your elected family of SF readers or like-minded readers, becomes easier to join rather than the situation in the 80s and 90s where I had to trek all the way to London to the Fifth Valley to get anything I had to read. SM as a community, as a conversation rather than as a genre, I think that's really what, if there is anything that's been nostalgic about, and that's something we're going to get more of in the future.
I think that, there is something certainly to be said for that. There's no question that anybody who was, I wasn't old enough with, but anybody who was reading science fiction in the 50s and 60s lived in a time when you could read everything that was published, and the community was small enough that you could see everybody and continue conversations, and it was a very different feel. I think something like Joe Walton's book, even though she's isolated, is a little bit about the nostalgia for that period of time. And we are currently living through a disruption in the publishing world that goes far beyond science fiction. It is a disruption of the entire literary and intellectual conversation in the culture, where right now, even though the internet has allowed all of us a lot more access, it's access from our houses by ourselves, and we haven't, some of us have found a way to make community contacts there, but a lot of people feel kind of isolated about it. And it's harder to find the works that you want because, Amazon's not a good place to browse. And so if you know what you want, it's awesome. But if you want to look at a shelf that you used to have, hard to find. And so I think you're right. There may be some of that feeling going on of where is that, what's happened to our what's happened to that ability to
browse.
Yeah, and it may, I hope you're right that it's going to come back.
That's actually one of the ways that the online science fiction community is really helpful, because you get word of mouth. And there is so much more being published now than there was even 40 years ago. I mean, just the sheer volume of science fiction and fantasy that is being published is, I can't keep up with it. Yeah, I mean.
I think that's a good thing. I don't want to be
Oh,
able to
yeah.
know everything
Yeah.
that's been written. That's bad. I think it's much better for me to think about, wow, there's so much that's possible that's beyond my particular subjective reality that I could then interact with. So I think it's actually a positive thing, even though it might be a threatening thing, because it's a change. But
I think you're absolutely right. It's just another one. I think it's another way, another aspect of that social position where we're in a revolutionary period. It's a big change from the old science fiction world that was small enough to be encompassed by a single mind. And now that's a great thing. But figuring out how to live there is hard. And we're all trying to do that.
That's the social engineering that we need to be working on.
Right.
I think we have time for one more question, so there's one in the back on the aisle. Yes.
With the digitizing of the industry, of the publishing industry, and I'm not talking about publishers now buy according to the Amazon categories.
I don't know if I agree with that, actually. I think in some ways it's become much easier for a marginal or liminal book to find an audience. Because the problem with this idea, the idea, when you walk into a bookstore, books are arranged in categories.
Yes, and when you walk into an e-book store or an online bookstore, they're arranged in categories. And the whole idea, they're talking about serendipity, is very related to this.
But some of those categories are produced by algorithms that look at, well, this person bought these books, so they must have something in common. It's not as top-down as you're portraying it. Some of it is derived from how people actually read. And in this case, this has definitely led to me discovering books I might not otherwise have discovered, that are liminal cases, that are sort of halfway between science fiction and literature or whatever.
But that is one of the things that we are undergoing right now, is trying to make those algorithms that are good enough. Right.
Yeah.
They do some good work now, but they're not nearly good enough. And that's one of the big challenges in the increasingly large electronic marketplace is make those things really good, and it'll be better than a bookstore in terms of, and that considered that you can get really good at those algorithms.
Well, and that's what Goodreads is for.
No.
We
No.
Yes.
Yep, we got this.
Thank you all very much.